Welcome to IT Guy Who Lives podcast. I'm your host Palash Gupta, registered medical scientist from University of Texas, MD Anderson Cancer Research Institute, USA, bachelor's in sports and exercise science from Loughborough University, UK, and diploma in nutrition and fitness sciences from INFS India. The goal of this podcast is to understand the science and science based tools with the help of industry experts so that we can further optimize our training and nutrition program. With that in mind, let's jump straight into today's podcast. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are going to have our first ever roundtable discussion with two Captain Americas, one indigenous and one endogenous, right? Because both of them have started with this agenda of guiding people with evidence-based practice, and both of them are doing really great job in their respective fields and in their respective communities. So let me pass the baton towards the mentors of the, or basically stars of the show. And whom should I pass on to first? Who would like to introduce themselves first?
Please,
Okay.
JC, go for it.
Please,
Okay,
Jesse, please give. Yep, 100%. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Palash. Before I introduce myself, I have to say that I'm not an expert on fitness and nutrition. Dr. Eric Helms actually is, and over the years, I've learned a lot from him and the likes of him, Alan, Menno, and these guys are the real experts. So I wouldn't consider myself as an expert in this. I'm just a guy who tends to relay information. And so I don't want anybody to have that wrong notion in their heads. I'm founder of Fitter, and we help people get fit, in a sustainable and easy manner. So thank you so much.
Perfect, short and sweet. Yeah. So, Dr. Eric, I think you work a lot on sustainable paradigm shift for not only for Gen Pop and especially for athletes, right? Whether it's powerlifting or comp prep or physique sports. So, would you like to give us a brief background about your sustainable practices?
Yeah, I mean, first, the thing I want to say is that while Jitendra was introducing himself, I just couldn't stop staring at how awesome he looks in that shirt. That's all I noticed. So,
Exactly.
yeah. I'm sure he said some amazing things, but I was too blinded by the physique. But no, in all seriousness, it's an honor to be here. Good to talk about it. And yeah, I think the way I consider myself as both a practitioner, educator, and a researcher is primarily from the perspective of like long-term sustainable performance. So when I say sustainability, I don't mean making sure that physique athletes can recycle their protein shakers. I mean that their performance is something that lasts a whole career. So that means it has intersections with health, mental health especially, and we're thinking about burnout, injury, and things like metabolic effects, which is probably pretty relevant to what we're going to be talking about today. And always thinking with a performance from a career perspective rather than, hey, let's get the best performance we can this season, but at the cost of anything in the biopsychosocial realm, if you will. So that's kind of the framing that I come from, I guess, when I look at research or when I speak as an educator or I act as a coach.
Perfect. Again, pretty well defined and explained. So let me just briefly describe the agenda for today's roundtable discussion. The agenda is when we are trying to go to the essential levels of body fat, right? And let me clearly describe it here. The essential levels for body fat that we are going to discuss here, it's around 4 to 8%, or like even 4 to 9% for males, or 14 to 18% for females, right? Whether it's a physique sport, or even the reason we are going that low in a body fat percentage, if you are in a contact sport, so that you can increase your speed, agility, power, you can basically increase your strength to mass ratio, as NSC likes to describe it, right? So, but doing that, or like trying to achieve that, you might sometimes feel some sort of a repercussion, some sort of a odd events while going down into that deep hole, right? So that is the entire premise behind this particular roundtable session. Both of you not only are expert in your field in terms of, I'm not saying that we are not PubMed ninjas. We are not just exploring all the research paper, meta-analysis, systematic use. That is a part of the hierarchical evidence that we swear by, because being an evidence-based practitioner, like at least requires us to stay on top of the evidence, but also we are coming with a lot of anecdotal and observational experience, because as if I mention JC, he has transformed about 2 to 3 lakh people as of now. Correct me if I'm wrong, JC.
I
Uh,
mean, the system has transformed, yes.
yep,
The
yep.
community, yes.
But you build that system, right, on a good
Yes,
principle, on
yes.
sound principles, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of people have transformed. Not only those are Gen Pop, but they have masked their journey upon really, really essential body fat levels like contest prep, and because people want to look like a Greek god at the end of the day, because the goals are ever changing. And not only that, you yourself are an athlete. Jesse himself is an athlete, and he stays pretty lean year around because it potentiates his contact sports requirement and speed and agility. The same goes for Dr. Eric Helms. Not only he himself participated in multiple iron sports, whether in terms of like Olympic lifting or you iron powerlifting or even physique sport. He is a WNBF pro natural bodybuilder. So, and not only that,
I'm not yet a WNBF pro. I have a pro card in a less competitive organization. It's the
INBF.
INBA.
Oh, okay,
So
got it.
there's
Got
like
it.
a thousand of them. So it's just one of those things that is a goal of mine. That's the only reason I'm correcting you, but I haven't achieved it yet. But one day.
Perfect, perfect. So on top of you, both of you folks transforming yourself, you have transformed a lot of your athletes as well, right? Whether it's a Gen Pop or athletes. So you have a lot of anecdotal observations, basically evidences, and based on taking all that data along with the scientific data, we can finally summarize what, like how better we can indulge or march upon the practices that we as a coach, so that our clients don't have to suffer those things which we suffered when we started, because there was not much of an evidence, let alone the evidence or anecdotal, right? So I hope the agenda is pretty clear at this point. Got it. So before I hand over the baton, I just want to make one statement, that the universe exists whether we can measure it or not. It's the flaws in our measuring tools which are becoming the bottleneck, which leads to something called McNamara fallacy, that states that if I can't measure it, it doesn't exist, which finally leads to one of the greatest and the most beloved statement of Dr. Eric Helms himself, that absence of evidence doesn't lead to evidence of absence, right? So I think a lot of listeners, once they listen to this initial statement, it will be harder for them to wrap their head around. But down the line, once we start exploring this discussion, we will obviously gonna march upon, or we are gonna address a lot of elephants in the room. So let me pass the baton towards JC, because in our previous basically integration or conversation, JC mentioned that when you are marching towards an essential body fat level, you can deploy a lot of strategies, some sort of a progression work, where by doing so, you can not only minimize the repercussions that you are going to feel in terms of your metabolic health or biomarker health, but you can might as avoid those. So I don't want to put words in Jesse's mouth, or I definitely don't want to speak on behalf of him. So Jesse, please, the baton is in your court, and please you can start with that.
Thanks a lot, Palash. I think the whole argument is based around the fact that staying at essential levels of body fat percentage, is it sustainable? Is it good in the long run? And can anybody do it? My my argument to that is basically yes. I believe everybody can do that, and yes, there are certain things which, of course, Dr. Eric Helms will be presenting from his side, and I'll be basing my arguments to kind of support my stance on this, and I'll be using a lot of analogies with learning how to bicycle, right? The opening argument would be that yes, you can stay at a essential body fat percentage year after year after year if you focus on the right approach without facing any kind of repercussions. That's my opening statement, and yeah, that's my opening statement. And
That's great.
yeah.
Yeah, so I just wanted to interrupt before I hand the baton towards Dr. Eric Helms. It's pretty good, and it's pretty evident that the literature is still really murky in murky waters right now, because a lot of studies, they are coming from endurance-based athletes, right? And they are coming on the female athlete triad. Once they march their journey upon the essential levels of body fat, they start losing their menstruation cycle. But On the other hand, both of you are pretty good, great coaches. Both of you have comp prep yourself, not only yourself, but your athletes as well. So your athletes must have told you something based on the observational or anecdotal data, what kind of feelings that they are like having at the end of the prep, or like when they are going down in the prep or coming out of the prep. So Eric, based on these, whether in terms of a literature-based evidences or your own practice-based evidences, what is your go-to statement on what are the repercussions that a particular athlete or a gen pop faces, if there are any, in the general?
Yeah. So I think before I get into the like the anecdotal experience I have, I think it's important for us to talk about like what is known on this topic, because as you introduced, there is an absence of evidence in some areas of this, which is actually really intriguing. So a concept that everyone needs to be familiar with is what's called relative energy deficiency in sport, or RED syndrome. You mentioned female athlete triad, and this is where this research started with a number of researchers, but probably most notably Ann Lukes back in the 90s. And she's looked more specifically at some of the impacts on amenorrhea and other secondary effects to the female athlete triad, which is related to low bone mineral density, the cessation of the menstrual cycle, disordered eating, and it has effects that span out to what is now called REDS. So relative energy deficiency in sport can happen to anyone, male or female, and it is specifically caused by low energy availability. And energy availability, and this is what Ann Lukes has done, is the causative factor is not body fat percentage. It is actually how much you're eating relative to the needs of your body.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing here is that if you were to look at all the papers that relate energy availability to outcomes, they're never looking at extremely lean people. They're looking at reasonably lean people at best. And the evidence that suggests it is energy availability, that how much you consume relative to how much your needs are based on how much you're exercising relative to your lean body mass, that suggest, oh, it's not body fat percentage, or when they've taken women with obesity or who overweight and they restrict their calories severely, and we start to see the same LH pulsatility changes. So menstrual cycle irregularity causing effects that will happen downstream. Interestingly enough, though, that's not the only spoke of the wheel on REDS. It has multiple effects. And to really understand what's going on with REDS, we have to go all the way back to the mechanism. And it all starts with the hypothalamus. Okay. So the hypothalamus is kind of like the master controller on many factors in our body, and we can specifically refer to its impacts on sex hormone production and just hormonal balance, metabolic effects. And an important thing to understand is that leptin, and I'm trying not to get too deep in physiology here, but it's an important core piece of the understanding here. Leptin, our so-called kind of master metabolic controller, has an impact on the hypothalamus. So specifically, when leptin is very low, which does happen when you are in a state of low energy availability, this can have an impact where it can suppress the HPG axis, the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. So importantly, so we think, okay, we're not eating as much, leptin is down, HPG axis is suppressed, and we start to see drops in estrogen, drops in testosterone. So we see hypogonadism in men, very low testosterone, and we see amenorrhea in women. And then we also see everything else that happens. Not everything's directly caused by this effect on the HPG, but many of the other things are also impacted by low leptin, having various signaling effects on the rest of the body. So that's one thing we have to, it sounds like we're all on the same page. Lots of nodding. Yes, we're all good with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So here's what's wild, though. When we look at the relationship between body fat percentage and leptin, it's super strong. So that is something that's really interesting. So there's work going back to the 90s. I think specifically, there was a paper published by Considine in 1996. They had 139 individuals ranging from a normal level to what is classified as obesity class 1, I think. And there was a 0.85 R-score relationship between body fat percentage and leptin. So to some degree, we can't completely disentangle the effect of body fat on this. We don't have randomized controlled trial data, but it is, I could use it almost as part of my point that, hey, there's no research on really, really lean people to see the relationship. And that might be because most people can't stay lean for us to find this relationship.
Yeah.
What happens in bodybuilders when you get them really, really lean and then you say, okay, now hang out here for a bit. Well, unfortunately, they all get fat, or most of them do. I shouldn't say all, but I had the unique pleasure of working, or at least advising, James Longstrom, who did his master's with Dr. Bill Campbell at University of South Florida. And his goal for his master's was to compare two different post-contest dietary strategies, one being a quote-unquote recovery diet approach and one being a quote-unquote reverse diet approach. And the main distinction was that one was a slow increase in calories, trying to minimize body fat regain, the reverse diet, and the other was a aggressive increase in caloric intake, getting into a caloric surplus, reducing cardio, and attempting to regain weight purposely to enhance recovery from the dieted state. Okay. And we can talk about the rationale behind them, but before I do that, let's just finish the story of, what did Longstrom and colleagues find? So unfortunately, it's hard to recruit physique athletes, and this is part of the reason why we have that evidence of absence. So they think they had in total 4 women and 3 men who were able to complete this, who actually did a show and did something afterwards. This was presented in 2019 at the ISSN conference. So it hasn't gone through rigorous peer review as a published paper, but it is an abstract. So that's another, asterisk on this data. But you can check out this poster, and it's pretty cool. And they attempted to have, I think half of these subjects do the recovery, half of these subjects do the reverse. And it didn't end up being an RCT because people couldn't stick to the post-contest plan, which is also intriguing and explains to you how it's difficult once you've been dieted to stay in that same condition. But what they did look at was relationships between the amount of weight and body fat gained and changes in their various hormonal and metabolic markers. And some important things they found were that, well, for one, if you looked at the 2 men who stayed under 10% body fat, they had no change in leptin, or it was within the error measurement. It actually went down by like 0.01 in one of them, which is probably not a real change, basically no change. And in the one woman who barely gained any body fat, she actually got her body fat up to where the 2 or 3 other women competed at. That's how lean she was. She also had a leptin value as the lowest among all of them, even after 10 weeks of following a reverse or recovery or something in between as they struggle with this approach. And at the group level, we also saw that there was a 0.9 correlation, that's a p-value of 0.001, with the percentage change in fat mass with the change in RMR. So that means resting metabolic rate basically stayed suppressed with a very tight correlation. 81% of the variance was explained by the change in body fat mass. And there was a 0.88 correlation with the change in body fat percentage with the change in leptin. So we have data suggesting that if your weight reduced, it's kind of hard to recover if you stay weight reduced, especially, and this seems to be more significant when in really, really lean people, because we do have some of the Rosenbaum data from the early 2000s and Liebel and colleagues, if I recall correctly, and they looked at people who had lost 10% of their body weight and maintained it for more than a year, and they still had some lingering effects on the predicted energy expenditure. But maybe you can live with that. That's not saying they had REDs. It's just saying, hey, they burned 6%, fewer calories than you might expect or something like that. Like, hey, start eating broccoli and chicken. It's not a big deal. You'd be all right. You have the right kind of diet. But there is potentially something else going on once you get to really low body fat levels, which could be shown in some of these studies. So right now, we don't have the RCT data. We probably won't. And it is very challenging to disentangle the effects of chronic low energy availability from like 6 months of dieting versus the place they got to. But we can see, at least in a 10-week, or I should say 9 to 11-week post period, that's when these people were measured in this Longstrom poster presentation, that if you maintain a very low body fat percentage, some of these key markers like leptin really don't change much if you maintain a low body fat. Maybe another 10 weeks later, that would have changed. But there certainly wasn't any indication with around 2 months of refeeding slowly enough to keep body fat quite low. So that's kind of where I'm at. Is I've always been curious about this specific question. Is it just energy availability that has the causative factor all in this? And we have the mechanistic data of understanding how leptin impacts the HPG axis. And we have some of this, I would say, observational data. Like I said, it isn't quite a controlled trial, that suggests, maybe when we're talking super lean people, it's a slightly different ball game. But the last thing I will say, and another construct, and I've taken way more time than Jitendra took, so I'll shut up for a bit after this, is that we have to understand like what happens to people, what regulates body weight, and our current theoretical model that lines up with the most evidence and hasn't been disproven as a theory is what's called the dual intervention model. We often just kind of say set point or settling point when we're talking in the fitness community, but what's really being described is that each person has an upper and a lower intervention point where their body seems to intervene by inducing some of the effects of increasing energy expenditure and the drive to eat, or decreasing energy expenditure and the drive to eat, based upon where your body weight and body fatness are at. And importantly, these are not purely biological signals. They're affected by the environment. That's why we have the obesity epidemic. I don't think we've had a fundamental change in the intervention points in the last 50 years. I think we've had high calorie foods that are affordable and jobs where I can talk to two people across the world on my computer, and I don't move as much. So all that together tells us something, that we're all a little different. And I've definitely had some athletes, and I've worked with some athletes, and I've met some other competitors who, hanging out 6 pounds or 3 kilos over stage weight, they feel fine. But I can also tell you that they're about as rare as someone who has, class 3 obesity or class 4 obesity. So I think there are definitely people who can do exactly what Jitendra describes. And if they had the right environmental conditions, and the right job, and habits that were really non-conducive to it, they might have been spending most of their life at a body fat percentage far above where they would normally be intervening. And you get those people down, and they could be the shining example of someone who can stay lean all year round. And I think there are people who, just do that naturally. I think they're quite rare. And I think there's also people who can get there reasonably lean and stay there, and they might have some negative effects, but they won't have every single spoke of the wheel of REDS. So this is something where I don't think we can completely divorce the amount of fat mass you have on your body from it, because fat mass secretes leptin. So that's something we have to understand as well. So I mentioned earlier, leptin has a relationship with fat mass. Why is that? Because adipose tissue is an organ, and it does secrete leptin. You get leptin from what you eat, but there's a disentanglement. You can't separate the leptin in your body from the amount of body fat that's present. So I think from our mechanistic understanding of this, there must be some effect of body fat on these things. But the question is how much and for whom, and how does that impact sustainability? And I think that's an individual question, personally.
Yeah. So I would like to throw a tangent here, because a lot of time when I started my journey of being a biostatistician, I had a lot of problem statement and research question, because in research, the most important thing is to coin the good research question. Everything lies on that, right? And if I take a research question let's see if I can take really good lean people and I make them extremely lean, what are the consequences are going to be? And if I take this problem statement and go to the IRP board or ethics board, so they will tell me, okay, so you are purposefully trying to see that if you take really good lean people and make them extremely lean, whether they will lose their menses if they are female, or whether they will lose their libido or become hypogonadal if they are male. They will straight rejected. Even though the research question is so strong, because the entire strength sport or contact sport community relies on the strength to mass ratio, we are just blocked by the ethical community or the IRB board. So since this becomes a limiting factor, I think this is the reason there are no RCTs, and there won't be any, basically, because it's a bit becomes unethical. And the second thing is, what will happen that even if someone like pitch this to the IRP board, they won't agree to it. So we are left with what? Observational or case reports. So we will start picking and choosing those athletes who have done those on their own, and then we will ask, starting asking the questionnaires. Have you experienced this? Have you experienced that? Have you experienced low libido, low energy availability, loss of menses? And if we happen to collect a lot of evidences, a lot of people are like saying the same thing, we can somehow connect the dots that it might be true, right? Just because we can't measure it as of now because of our ethical issues and all, but it is true at some point. Even though the evidence is purely case report and anecdotal or observational, we cannot just straightly neglect it by saying that there is no RCT. So, what are both of your takes on this? Because research question is pretty strong. We want to say it, but we are limited by the ethics community. But now we have case reports. Some case reports are on the both the side. People are saying that I say around 4 to 8%. I feel no issues. I think the same opening statement said by JC as well. On the other hand, the amount of athletes that I have handled, and both of you handle way lot more athletes, you must be having a lot of case reports and observational data. Most of people will also say that they feel these kind of symptoms. Hence, we are again spinning our wheels whether what is the good approach or what is the right progression for framework, right? So, what are your? I think JC mentioned that there has to be a framework where we can minimize these repercussions, and if we done it right, people can stay lean or in essential body fat levels till the life. I think this is what you said, right, Jesse? So I would
Yeah.
like you to explain what is the progression framework that you follow with your clients and what you follow on your own, right?
So first of all, thank you so much, Eric. I think after that, the points of contention are very less. My biggest point of contention when I spoke to Palash first was that, secondary amenorrhea does not have anything to do with body fat percentage. Yes, I'll come to the fact that there might be something which we'll probably see when more data is there. But what we do have now are actually two studies. One is CF Sanborn from 1987, and then there's one more study from PJ Stock. It's in 1991, and both of these reports clearly highlight the fact that there's no relationship between amenorrhea and low levels of body fat percentage. So I know that we don't have any recent data on this, but at least this is what we have. And I think out of all the three problems, the metabolic health, bone density, and amenorrhea, I think amenorrhea is one which is kind of predominantly the big question here, right? So I think there are two studies. Maybe if we dig deeper, we'd probably find more. So I think that part is clarified, Palash. I hope now you know that both of us are on the same page, that athletic amenorrhea does not have anything to do with low levels of body fat percentage. Coming to the question on leptin. Now, what we have seen from existing data is leptin does not just affect lean people or people who are on contest prep. It equally affects the people who are obese. Because leptin, it's a relative marker, it's a relative marker. So let's say if you're an obese individual and if you start eating less food, that will also affect your leptin levels, right? So when leptin kind of affects both a group of people in a similar setting, it's very difficult to say that leptin induced hypothalamic changes are only limited to individuals who are lean. So basically 2 points. One, body fat percentage does not induce amenorrhea in women. Second, the diet-induced leptin does not have any negative side effects only in leaner population. It can affect anybody. I hope these 2 points are clear.
So, would you like to take on these 2 points? Because the first point, I think you mentioned a lot of things, Eric. It's not the body fat percentage, it's basically the low energy availability, which induces these repercussions. And once you are going to the essential levels of body fat, basically you are going to be in a low energy availability environment, whether you choose it or not. So, your first point,
Maybe.
Which is, the definitions that we have of LEA, you see the IOC consensus 2014 and then an addendum to that 2018. it's a very, how do you call it? It's not a definitive measure.
It's a murky. It's a murky. Yeah.
It's not a
So this is
definitive measure, and there are a lot of factors which can affect LEA. It could be your stress, it could be your extensive dieting period, it could be too much of training, it could be your existing pre-illness. Some of the studies which did kind of study amenorrhea in athletic women also found out that that a lot of women who experienced secondary amenorrhea already had some signs of amenorrhea at an earlier period, right? So yeah, I just wanted to kind of highlight this. Yeah, go ahead. You were saying something.
Yeah, all great points, and I think so. The 2 points you made are actually quite interesting. So, for one, it is absolutely true that the current data we have on the people who've been studied and the body fats that have been measured, we see that there's an independent effect of energy intake, really energy availability, on amenorrhea. Now, whether or not it is directly or indirectly affected by body fat percentage, I think is primarily and directly, and this is my hypothesis, I don't have data to back this up, related to energy availability.
Yeah.
Because what we know is that on average, when you look at studies on people dieting, there's going to be an impact on energy expenditure. So to maintain a low body fat percentage for some people, that means they'll have to maintain a lower energy intake.
Yeah.
So that means that some people, like if we talked about the studies where we saw on people who have reduced their weight by 10%, for some people, even at maintenance energy intake, they will still be experiencing low energy availability. And Jitendra, to your point, this is a range. So the original threshold that was proposed by Lukes was based on overweight and obese sedentary women, and that was 30 kcals for fat-free mass. For athletes, though, it is often sometimes in the range of like 30 all the way up to maybe 45 because they're not sedentary. And it's an arbitrary line in the sand between what we call exercise activity or non-exercise activity. Your body doesn't actually know that you stepped in the gym. It just knows that you're burning a certain amount of calories per unit of time. So if that is above and beyond your basal requirements, to some degree, that's going to have an effect on energy availability and what is reserved for physiological function. So, I've modeled along with Eric Trexler some kind of standard responses to dieting for fun. If we kind of look at some of the averages that's in this research, and what you might expect is, say, a 15% reduction in total daily energy expenditure at the end of a contest prep. That's a decent guess on average. There are absolutely people who experience less than that, and there are unfortunately absolutely people who experience more than that. So if you were to start at a point, let's say you dropped from 85, 86 kilos down to, let's say, 70 kilos. So this could apply to a pretty muscular woman, or say a lightweight or middleweight man. And then you were to increase your calories back up to maintenance, but not gain weight, assuming that, you would still be below 30 kcals. You'd still be below that 30 kcal threshold on average. So that's going to make it challenging. Even though you're eating at maintenance, that's a reduced maintenance. That's a maintenance that can only be sustained because there's reductions in energy expenditure, which requires you to stay in that state of low energy availability. So I think even if it is true that there is no direct impact of body fat, if you can't get your calories up high enough to induce a state of non-low energy availability, or sufficient energy availability is probably a more grammatically correct way of saying that, then you may be there anyway, even if the causative mechanism is not body fat. So that's the point one. And so that kind of excludes, if we use that model, a fair amount of people from being able to stay like that lean, like contest lean. The second point I would make is that low leptin impacts people regardless of how high their body fat is. That's 100% true. But interestingly enough, there are absolutely differential effects on people higher in body fat or lower in body fat who undergo the same caloric deficit. And indeed, they're opposite effects. So we actually have a fair amount of data on men specifically showing that when you take someone who is overweight or obese and you put them in a caloric deficit, on average, they see either slight increases in testosterone or not much of a change at all. And then when someone is a little lighter, we actually have a recent meta-analysis that showed this. When they're at a quote unquote normative range of body fat, there's not much of a change in testosterone levels. However, when you're lean in this meta-analysis, this actually wasn't included in the analysis because only 2 studies. But in both of those 2 studies where they had lean participants, they had a reduction in testosterone. So the effects of leptin in someone who is with obesity are often actually promoting leptin resistance. So it is a different mechanism. It's kind of like type 1 and type 2 diabetes, if you will. It's the lack of production of it because maybe you're really super, super lean. Or it is the saturation of it because you've been a chronic caloric surplus, very high body fat, and there's actually resistance centrally to leptin and having these both negative effects on testosterone. So I would agree with that 100%. And we don't have high quality data in women, but at least in men, I'm confident saying that when you take an overweight male or a lean male and you diet them, you will get sometimes the exact opposite effects, which I think does indicate that body fat is playing a role here to some degree. And it's hard to step away from that. And that's actually data that goes all the way back to 1969. There's a study by, and you guys are going to have to help me with the pronunciation because this isn't an Indian researcher. Surya Narayana, 1969. Yes, thank you. I think it is actually named after one of the Hindu gods. Is that right?
Yeah, God Surya. Yeah, Lord Surya.
Yeah, lots
Okay.
of gods.
Okay. I tried to Google to get the pronunciation.
Every Indian name is kind of named after a god. Yeah.
You guys are all gods. I have much respect. But anyway, they had it was a small study. This is the first time I saw this, and I remember this paper specifically because I wrote about it in my master's. And they had 6 men, and they were dieted, and they saw that they actually didn't see a change in luteinizing hormone, plasma testosterone, or follicle stimulating hormone while being put into pretty large deficit. But then we have all these other studies. For example, Rossau, the case study of the bodybuilder, Nair in 1987. And all the ones that I've talked about in that meta-analysis, where you take lean people, you diet them, and we see these at least temporary reductions in testosterone. So there are divergent effects on lean versus non-lean individuals when they start dieting, and this is probably why it gets, or at least part of the reason why it gets progressively harder when you diet through a contest prep, because it's the kind of the double hit, if you will. And again, that's limited to the data we have on men. But it is interesting. And one more comment I'll make, a bit of a side tangent, but it kind of goes back to what you were saying about the necessity for an RCT and how we view that, and kind of being an evidence-based practitioner, Palash, and you'll appreciate this as a biostatistician. I think probably the best we can get with the current limitations we have when we're studying physique athletes is going to be these quasi-experimental designs, where we take physique athletes and we ask them what they did, and then we operationally define, which group were you in. And like that's the best evidence we're probably going to have on like carb loading for peak week. And there was a study that came out about that. And I'm not holding my breath for when 20 physique athletes and another 20 physique athletes like, yeah, sure, mess up my peak. I'm fine with that. It's probably not going to happen. So I think to some degree, the only thing I would caution against is like being like, hey, look, we don't know because there's no RCTs. And I think in this conversation specifically, that's never going to get us anywhere. It reminds me of the systematic review, which is hilarious. I don't know if you guys have seen this, that recommends against using parachutes. It's a classic. It's a classic.
Another systematic review like that recommends not using seat belts while driving. So
we don't have any RCTs comparing no seatbelt use to seatbelt use. Therefore, based upon the hierarchy of evidence, we can't recommend it.
So, IRB will be like, you want to make people die or what? The same thing is like you want to purposely induce hypogonadism, whether in male and female. They'll be like, get out of my room, right? I'm canceling your masters as well.
By the way, they got away with that shit all the time in the 80s and 70s, but that's not happening anymore.
But IRB was like pretty lenient back then.
Oh yeah, do whatever the hell you want back in the 80s.
Yep. So I think the points which both of you mentioned, I can like to summarize based on the evidences that we have, right, before we march upon the anecdotal, based on the athletes that we have had, right? Because that is a much better, because we don't have much great data in terms of evidence. So the lack of evidence is going to be there, like which we call like since there are no RCTs because of purely ethical and IRB related issues, and nobody wants to put their money on making jacked people more jacked, right? Because there are other things to worry about in this world, like diabetes, obesity, and cancer research. So there will be a gap in literature, and it might stay for a while. But then again, we cannot directly say, neither we can say that low energy availability and REDs are the cause of hypogonadism in male and female, nor we can say that REDs or low energy availability is not a cause. Right. So we cannot have a consensus statement as of now because the evidence itself is pretty murky. Hence, all we have is our own client specific data, was like just as you mentioned, quasi-experimental data, where we collect a lot of evidences, case reports, survey questionnaires, cross-sectional studies, and then we try to make some sort of a inference from that. Okay, if out of 100 people, 80 people are saying that they are feeling these kind of issues like low in libido, like hypogonadism, like loss of menses, when they go march their journey towards the essential body fat level, there might be some truth behind it. There might be, and I want this to happen, that there's no truth behind it. Maybe I did my dieting wrong when I did the contest prep lean, right? And I'm willing to like learn more so that from this point onwards, once I hear the progression framework of JC and both Dr. Helms, I'll be able to guide my athletes in much better way so that they don't have to face these kind of repercussions. But unfortunately, as of now, there is no consensus statement in terms of literature. Now, would like to share this conversation on the more anecdotal or athlete specific data, right? Because all the athlete specific data, all the case reports showing that there is some truth behind it, but we can't be sure. So I would like to first of all, I would like to say that does this interpretation of mine in terms of literature, gaps in literature, is good, or both of you want to add some points just to as a closing statement for the first part?
Yeah, I'd like to make a statement, and again, building on top of leptin, because that seems like the big villain here. One of the things about leptin is it's not just induced through one or two things. It's not really because you're starving. It's basically your perception of starvation, right? And there's a close correlation between palatability and leptin, which I'm sure Eric would agree on, and he'd know where I'm going. One of the frameworks which uh, I actually use when I want people to get leaner without starving, which would also kind of ensure that their leptin levels are not going haywire, is to make sure that they are eating foods which are high in satiety, and that's absolutely the game changer. So just ensuring that people eat a lot of food without feeling hungry, because leptin levels are very closely associated to your feelings of hunger rather than actual hunger. I mean, it might be associated with actual hunger too, but the feelings of hunger is there are researchers which tell us that leptin levels might get are closely associated with how palatable your foods are, right? So just by eliminating high palatability foods and making sure that people are eating a lot of food, which is high in satiety, can actually ensure that LEA can be avoided and any other negative repercussions which are due to elevated levels of leptin can be avoided. Yeah.
So this statement is a bit harder for me to grasp because even if you are like adding a lot of fiber and all, you will be in a calorie restricted environment. You are counting your calories, right, at the some point. And if you are at 8% body fat or like even 4 to 5% of contest lean, whether you feel subjective hunger or not, your body does not have enough adipose tissue to begin with, right? So
That's why you're never
you cannot
going in a
circumvent.
hypocaloric range. You're creating gradual deficit, which is not too much. You're always staying above your BMR. You're staying at your maintenance.
So
And
whether I create a hypocaloric state or not, if I am at a contest stage lean condition, like my quote unquote that organ is not there as much as I want in my body. My body will say, okay, I don't have that much of an adipose tissue. I will stop secreting leptin it, or like that is the mechanism point of view that Dr. Eric Helms mentioned in the very first part of the agenda. Like I would like to have like much more details based on the statements that JC made. What are your thoughts on the statements
Yeah,
that JC has
so
made?
on this, before we go to Dr. Eric Helms, that I think leptin isn't just directly associated with your low levels of body fat percentage, but it is also associated with your levels of hunger or perceived feeling of hunger as well as palatability. Just kind of making it all inclusive so everybody understands we're on the same page. Sure.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with the data on perceived hunger.
Hmm.
I'm not going to make any confident statements there,
So
and it's one down.
1999,
Yep.
E. Renaud. I can share the data with you. So serum leptin and perception of palatability during a standardized high carbohydrate breakfast test. We have some data.
Sure.
1999, E. Renaud.
Okay. I think the highest relationships I've ever seen in the data in non-dieting individuals just at baseline is with body fat. That's not to say that there aren't other things that affect leptin.
Yeah.
High intensity exercise impacts leptin. Various things do impact leptin, that's for sure. But I think there's something to be said for thinking about chronic leptin levels versus, say, post-meal, postprandial leptin levels
Yes.
and perceptions. And I would put forth that I'll concede because I'm not super familiar with the data, but I think you're being honest. Like that's the principle of charity in action, folks. Is that there? I'm sure palatability and satiety impacts leptin. My guess would be it's probably going to be impacted the most by things like energy availability and body fat levels.
Yeah.
So, like for example, if we look at kind of all the other data that we're talking about right now, leptin resistance in people with very high body fats who are in a caloric surplus, that seems to happen. And there's a lot of covariates here, of course, or cross-sectional relationships that are in the 0.8 to 0.9 range with body fat or fat mass change or baseline body fat with leptin levels. So, and I certainly don't think leptin's the villain here, but I definitely think that it is one of the signals that is related to that represents the effect of body fatness and energy availability on the HPG axis. So I'm reasonably confident with saying, hey, if someone can maintain appropriate physiological levels of leptin, then they're probably going to be okay. But that's something that is, just to give you an idea of how much researchers have tried to go down this pathway, they've had to go to the point of doing daily leptin injections to try to reverse this. And it's not like they haven't tried other things in the years. So I don't think that someone who would normally, be struggling in a certain point would be able to eat a lot of broccoli and high protein
Yeah.
and get the same effect of, say, being with another 10 pounds of body fat. I
Yep.
think we have a different magnitude there. So do I have experimental data to back that up? No, but I think based on our understanding of what types of things are being impacted here, that would be my guess.
Yeah, because it explains the mechanistic sense of it, right? I can have a lot of like aspartame and like a lot of calorie-free foods, which will make me full, but at some point, like that in organ, it's not there. Like just as Dr. Helms mentioned, that if you're not carrying enough leptin, no matter how many subjective changes that you do, no matter how much uh, uh, tricks you play in order to control your subjective hunger, your body will down regulate because you're not having the enough raw material to build that building in the first place, right? So I think there are always a secondary mechanism attached to everything, because if we are chasing high performance sport, we are making a deal with the devil. If I'm saying yes to one thing, I have to say no to other things, right, at the end of the day. Yeah, JC, you were trying to mention.
Which brings us to the question, and how is it that not every athlete faces low energy availability? And
Exactly.
why do so many athletes, and especially if you look at Olympic athletes, like the close combat sports, they require people to be lean 6 to 8%. Right? That's pretty lean. And out of, let's say, all of those guys, roughly 30% people are facing LEA. What about the 70%? What are the possible mechanisms through which these people are still able to maintain low levels of body fat percentage and still ace the game.
Yep,
What are
that's
those
true.
things?
Yeah,
That's how do we come to that conclusion? What are those guys doing?
exactly. So that is, Dr. Rekhan, so you were saying?
Yeah, I think I remember sitting down with my mom watching the Olympics one of these years, and she said something. I think it was swimming, and she was like, "It's amazing how swimming just makes all these guys have like the same body proportions and same body fat percentages and all that." And I was like, Mom, this is the Olympics. Like, there's probably
Outliers.
well, not even that. It's the bottlenecks to performance are gonna select for things,
Yes.
So I think when as humans we draw associations between things and often attribute cause and effect to them. That's natural. You swim, you're gonna look like a swimmer. To some degree, that's not untrue. Like, it's not like you're not gonna lose some body fat, become more active, gain a little bit of muscle in the amount that you'd see, but it's not going to make your rib cage wider or change the length of your humerus, right? So I was explaining to my mom that we're looking at probably the 12 best swimmers like in the world right now. Out of shit, how many swimmers do you guys think there are in the whole world? 50
Exactly.
million?
This part is pretty good. Yeah.
Easily.
Yeah. So I think when we get to the point where we start looking to elite athletes, we are to some degree looking at the factors genetically and environmentally which are going to
Yes.
select for the things that allow them to succeed. And there was actually a paper I reviewed where I think I observed this. This is really interesting. It was a paper in Mass. I can pull it up and let you guys know, and I'm going to paraphrase it. But if you're interested, I'd be happy to go into it because I don't have that off the top of my head. But it looked at female sprinters and which of them and how many were experiencing effects of REDs or markers of low energy availability. And it was actually the women higher in body fat percentage that were experiencing low energy availability. And I think that's because they were being told to diet, right? Like that's the conclusion to me. Like, to be at the elite level, the more body fat you carry, you're slower. So you're
Yeah.
going to have to be lean. So for the
Yeah.
people who are not naturally lean, they are, like you said, like you have to make a deal with the devil, like I'm a little bit faster, but I'm a little bit hungry all the time. And I might have
Yeah.
lower, I might have a slightly irregular menstrual cycle, and my iron status may not be great, or all these other potential markers. So the question that I get to, if we want to talk about what do we do as a practitioner,
Yeah.
now it comes down to not what's the leptin link to the mechanism, or how much leptin is secreted by adipose tissue or affected by your satiety signaling, or is it really have no impact, or is it a covariate at a threshold point of body fat with energy availability, and which spokes of REDs do I care about? Am I okay with a little bit of immune suppression? Maybe I just wear a mask or whatever. Like, that's not the thing that I think of. What I think of is, what are the risks? Because we don't have an a priori way of assessing whether or
Yeah.
not you're the person who can be really lean. And we have enough anecdotal data and case study data showing that when people attempt to do this, let's say the reverse diet, that there are potential negative consequences. And some of them can be reasonably severe. What comes to mind is a case study of a figure competitor, 2016 Halliday, I believe. And what you looked at is, this is someone who hung out at 55 kilos and competed at 50 kilos. And if you read the discussion, they specifically used a controlled return to a moderate calorie intake and a slow return to body weight. And it took them, I think, over 3 months to get back to 55 kilos, which again is already lean. If you look at this person's height, the level they were competing at, and how lean they got for competition. And it took them 71 weeks to get their menstrual cycle back, despite the fact that they had done kind of two things that we've talked about here. They got their body fat back up to 5 kilos heavier, predominantly from body fat, and they'd increased their calories sufficiently to do that. However, their approach still didn't fix the secondary amenorrhea. Now, this could be a single clinical issue, but I've seen this enough times.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
it's very difficult to disentangle these two things, but there is a significant risk to the athlete in even attempting it sometimes. And I think if you if we want to go down this track of, hey, let's try to stay, if we're talking about staying at essential levels of body fat, if I take my researcher hat off and I put my practitioner hat on, I think it's dangerous because it caters to people's potential already disordered body image and desire to look lean and be lean,
Yeah.
pressure from social media. And we're also potentially dealing with someone who may not be someone who can stay that lean, but they will want to. So telling them, hey, you know what? You could hang out at shredded conditions if you just do it right. That's something that they want to be true. And they might want it to be true at the cost of their mental or physical health. So I think this is something where you have to tread extremely carefully. And you have to think about the ethics and the risk, not the possibility that they might be someone who could do this, but the possibility that they might not, and the potential downsides if they attempt it. And obviously it's the client's choice, but we have a heavy impact on our clients' perceptions, what they believe to be true. They trust us. And I think this is something where you got to be careful and you got to think about that. And your relationship should be one where you're trying to mitigate risk and keep them heavily informed, and you're being honest about what you do and don't know. And from that perspective, yeah, I think I wouldn't personally be comfortable trying to help someone stay shredded unless that's something that they had demonstrated that they had done previously and in a healthy manner. If it was just their first go at it, I wouldn't be completely in 10 out of 10 cases like, no, we cannot try to stay shredded. We could do something like, hey, let's try to see how lean we can stay.
Yeah.
But I think if we're talking about essential body fat levels, whew, it's a little risky, you know? So.
Right. Thank you so much. Actually, I was kind of hoping that, we'd come to the fact that why are these Olympic level guys tend to, kind of achieve similar kind of body structure. Genetic factors aside, I think one of the key things which you would agree on is the years of training, which means that they have been in that environment and their body kind of adapts to that, right? So one
Yes.
can say that the longer somebody does something, form follows function, basic. All right. So longer one does something, the body kind of get used to it. And most of these guys, Olympic level guys, they're probably starting their training early from their childhood days, right? So they have much longer period. Now, to your ethics points, I 100% agree. I wouldn't go and tell somebody who's obese to kind of get like completely ripped, but I do believe that they can, given they spend a lot of time, allow their body to adjust. It's almost sort of like learning how to bicycle. If somebody comes to me, I'm not going to tell them, hey, you can't learn bicycle. It's risky. You're going to fall. You're going to break your bone. Sure, people do break their bones all the time. But the longer you do that, the better you get. So my whole point about this thing is that, look, everybody can stay shredded. The first few times it's going to be difficult, but the longer you do that, your body is going to get used to it, which is what we observe in elite athletes. And having done that myself and having trained so many people, we have so many examples in Twitter where people have stayed shredded for years after years after years, right? And I'm not saying that you should stay shredded just for your social norms. I think in my condition, it's probably just an outcome. I'm training at Tiger Muay Thai. Every other athlete is shredded. I mean, I don't even know if these guys know anything about dieting or training, but they're shredded. And it's probably because the training is such that the obvious outcome is that you're spending a lot more calories than you're consuming, right? So I would say that rather than focusing on a particular body image or particular a physique goal, people should focus on the sport. And the more they do that sport, everything else would then be outcome. Now, so this is how I would tell people that, look, you can get shredded, but don't focus on getting shredded. Just focus on building the right behavior, eat, high satiety foods, stay at your maintenance, don't do drinking, boozing, partying. And just by following the basics, you will get into decent body fat percentage soon. It might not be as low as essential body fat percentage, but still a good, respectable physique where you don't feel odd, Having said that, my stance is still the same, that if people want to get shredded, they can maintain the same physique, because over a period of time, something happens. Your body's physiology changes. It kind of gets used to it. Maybe the first few times you'll feel some side effects, but if you just do it right, then maybe you can negate those side effects. So I'm just saying that there might be a careful framework, at least there is a careful framework where if you do things in a right manner, you might minimize the risk of any of these repercussions which we are discussing today here. That's it.
So I would like to take mention my few caveats here. Let me take my biostatistician hat off and put the practitioner hat in, just as Dr. Helms mentioned. So, as an evidence-based practitioner, we know that our evidence-based practice is not built for those 1% elite in this world. It is built for the other 99% of Gen Pop. Right? As a science, elites will become elite if they put the work in. They have the genetics, they have the environmental factor. That's good. We want to hang our hat on those horses, but those are elite of the elite horses, and not everyone can see them. Right.
See,
So,
on that, on that,
yeah,
I have
just
an issue. On that, I
yeah.
have an issue. I will never distinguish somebody from somebody else. I have
Let,
no right
let
to
me
say
just complete. Yeah, yeah, got it.
1% of the elites.
Perfect. So let me just say my points here. I would want, let's suppose if I'm getting 100 clients, I would want that these 100 clients are genetically gifted. Even if I'm making them stay stage lean 4% or like 5% or even like 4 to 8%, they won't feel any kind of consequences. And that's where me as a practitioner would love to see that. But again, what I'm seeing time and time again, just as Eric mentioned, and just as you both of you mentioned that your body is really, really plastic in nature. The first time you do it, you might feel a lot of repercussion. Like it happens with the 1 week of dieting itself. Someone who has never even dieted, they will feel like they are breaking the heaven and earth, right? They are making a deal with the devil. Over the time period, your body keeps on adapting, and that started like embracing this new normal for you, right? Because now we have built up some good habits. But I'm not willing to discount on the fact that every time I'm making my athlete go into essential body fat levels, those issues are creeping up. Those metabolic markers are going down. Those biomarkers are going down. They are becoming hypogonadal, and they are telling me that they have not seen morning boners in the last 1 month, and they are having amenorrhea. I cannot say to them that, oh, don't worry. The next 5 times do you do the same, you will get better. So, I mean, as a practitioner, I just can't do that. I mean, like, okay, maybe 4 to 8% is not for you. Maybe you are not in that genetic lottery pool. Let's get back to 10 to 12%. See how you feel. Okay, they started getting feeling better and they started getting back to their normal physiological state. Then again, at, at that point, we have to take a lot of logistics into the action as well. That particular person still willing to go down because now they have tasted that particular reward. Now they have this kind of a perception that they look like this when they go to the essential body fat level, and they are not willing to let go of it, even though it costs them metabolical and mental issues and physiological issues, which I am aware of, which all of you are aware of. So neither I'm discounting on the fact that genetic elites or like people who keep on doing that again and again cannot adapt to it, nor I'm willing to discount the fact that if my clients, if I'm seeing a lot of case reports, not only in just literature, but within my own client, within my own self as a evidence-based practitioner, that man, no matter how many times I do, I still get these kind of repercussions. So maybe I am not the one who can sustain this lifestyle. I'm not genetically gifted. Maybe other 70 people, clients out of those 100 are also not genetically gifted. Let me take a more lenient approach for them, right? I would guide them that, okay, maybe it's not for you. Don't try to hang your hat on those extra 30 people who are staying shredded all the line, because it creates a confirmation bias. There's people in the health and fitness industry say that, yeah, I achieved this by doing this. Hence, this is the only framework which is gonna work for everyone. Like that's a early researchers confirmation bias issue, right? It shows that you have not walked the walk enough and you are just talking the talk again and again. You're just spinning the wheel. So these are my few caveats that I'm not see. Science and ethics are for Gen Pop, and I would love my Gen Pop client to become elite. I would love that they go to the Olympics and they stay shredded, and I will win as a researcher. But I'm not willing to take discount the fact that once they feel these kind of repercussions, I cannot just pass away by saying that, okay, this is your first time. Okay, maybe this is your second time. Okay, maybe this is your ninth time. you are still thinking, oh, maybe there is some issue into you. Maybe you find some other coach who can do it something with it. Because I've seen in evidences, whether it's a cross-sectional study, survey-related data, or like case reports, even myself, my other 70 people, I cannot discount that fact. So what are your takes on these points which I mentioned, Dr. Eric? How do you base your particular practices as an evidence-based practitioner, not as a researcher?